Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, two things are absolutely true when it comes to this channel. Number one, you guys seem to love any content related to American presidents and their history. And number two, you know that I absolutely love Ulysses S. Grant. He's one of my favorite historical figures, might be my favorite American of all time. I think he has an incredible story, and he seems just like a very genuinely decent and good human being. And that's not something we can say about everyone in history. So not perfect, certainly, but I thought this was an interesting video concept I saw from the channel Resyndicated. We've done a few of their videos in the past. This one's called "Why Has Ulysses S. Grant's Presidency Been Forgotten?" We've talked a lot about his pre-war life, his Civil War story, but not a lot about his presidency. And so I thought this would be an interesting topic, and I'm curious to hear what Resyndicated has to say about this topic. So I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. I'll also add this video to my entire playlist of U.S. presidents content, which I will pin in the comment section below so you can see every video I've ever made related to U.S. presidents. There's plenty of them out there. Check those out. Let's dive in. Oh, and I just need to mention, too, that I did not know when I put this shirt on this morning that I was going to be talking about General Grant, President Grant today. Total coincidence that I happen to be wearing a Grant shirt, so kind of cool that it worked out that way, though.
S. Grant's presidential term was 8 years, which is twice as long as the American Civil War. Yet the vast majority of writing on Grant is on his Civil War service. This is partly because of the monumentous significance of his role during the war, but also because of the era he presided over as president.
And it's interesting to note, too, that in his own autobiography, which he wrote in the months leading up to his death, finished it just days before he died, he spends a lot of time on the war and not a ton of time on his presidency.
Grant was president during the Reconstruction era, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, and consisted of Grant's presidency and, before him, Andrew Johnson's. Naturally, any period following a major war is less likely to spark the same interest and excitement as the war itself.
That's true.
In addition to this, there isn't much that can be romanticized about the Reconstruction era.
I mean, that's a great point he makes. It's an ugly time that, whether we should or not, Americans would probably just as soon forget the aftermath of the American Civil War. It's an incredibly important time in American history, and it's a very consequential time, because what happens from the end of the American Civil War, especially after Lincoln's assassinated and Johnson becomes president, what happens over those next several years is going to cause directly the next 100 years plus of civil rights history that we had an opportunity, as 4 million people were freed from slavery. We had an opportunity that we botched in a big way when it came to what to do with those people and how to help those people. And we just failed miserably. And unfortunately, I can't help but wonder how different the world would be if Lincoln had survived, rather than Johnson being president. By the time Grant comes in, we're already off on the wrong foot. And as much as I think he did right by the formerly enslaved people, I think he was fighting an uphill battle.
Following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson took office. As a Southern Democrat, Johnson took the nation in a different direction than Lincoln had intended to. His goal was to reintegrate the Southern states as quickly as possible. In regards to the newly freed slaves, Johnson felt no obligation to ensure their civil liberties were protected. This isn't to say there were no advancements in civil rights during this era. Beyond the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment stated that no state could infringe on civil liberties provided by the Constitution.
So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are a direct response to the end of the American Civil War. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery, except in cases where somebody's been convicted of a crime and all that. But the 14th and 15th Amendments are a direct response to the very obvious infringement on the civil rights of the newly freed, formerly enslaved people in the South especially, and it deals with citizenship and it deals with voting rights.
The 15th Amendment gave voting rights to United States citizens regardless of race, color, or prior slave status. However, without proper enforcement, the new laws were effectively useless.
Right.
Without employment or valuable skills, many freedmen returned to the plantations they'd worked as slaves, under work contracts which were essentially a form of neo-slavery.
It's totally what happened. I mean, these southern plantations just used a loophole to get around the 13th Amendment that basically, I mean, think about it. You go back to the place that you worked before as a slave, you sign a contract that means that you're working for no pay but just room and board, and that contract can be sold to another plantation owner, and you can't get out of it. So you're locked in, you're getting no wages, and you can be sold to someone else. It's literally slavery in all but name.
Violent groups of white Southerners, such as the Ku Klux Klan, prevented them from even exercising their new voting rights.
I would encourage you, even though it's a fictional story, to watch the movie Free State of Jones. I think it does an excellent job of showing just how absolutely awful things were for former slaves in the South after the Civil War.
It's likely things would have remained this way had Johnson had a second term.
Which never
Grant
was gonna
hated
happen.
Johnson's policies and immediately went to work changing the course of the nation. As president, he signed the 15th Amendment into law. As mentioned, white Southerners initially prevented blacks from exercising their new right, and in response, Grant used the military to prevent suppression of the black vote. By 1872, he'd effectively destroyed the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, and he actually creates the Justice Department during his administration specifically to take on the Klan, and he did. He literally, I mean, they effectively wiped out the Klan in the South, and the Klan ceases to be a major influential organization until the 20th century when it has a resurgence under, you know who I'm talking about, Thomas Woodrow Wilson.
The Klan would eventually reemerge, but only 43 years later.
Yep.
But much of the damage was already done. By the time Grant took office, 7 of the former Confederate states were readmitted into the Union, as Johnson's terms for admission had been very lenient.
Now, I will say this. Lincoln's plans for readmission were also pretty lenient. In fact, he had a plan in place before the war even ended that was called the 10% plan. And if you could get 10% of the eligible voters in that state, which would be white males at the time, to take an oath of allegiance to the Union, you could be readmitted. And there were some other caveats to it as well, but it was very, very lenient. The difference between Lincoln and Johnson was not their willingness to be lenient in readmitting and kind of reintegrating the southern states back into the Union. It was the way they dealt with the freedmen, as they were known, those 4 million people who had been freed from enslavement. That's the big difference. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat. He was a Southerner. He was a slave owner himself. He had no love for black people. Whereas Lincoln, though he had come a long way since 1860, the last speech he gave, public speech he gave, he started to talk about enfranchising black people. And very famously, John Wilkes Booth was at that speech, and he said, he turned to one of the other conspirators and said, he's talking about N-word voting. That'll be the last speech he ever makes. So it was really that part of things that was different. It wasn't the leniency toward the South.
From the day Grant entered the White House, he had limited options. But he was also facing the fact that many people were sick of anything to do with the war.
Yeah.
Not just the Southerners, but also Northerners.
This is so important to recognize, and I'm glad he pointed this out. Northern public opinion, people were exhausted by the war. The war killed something like 750,000 people. It used to be, they used to think it was a number around 600, 620, but the estimates have been revised upwards since then. 750,000 people died in this war. People were tired of it. And a lot of people, the war aims for the North started out as restore the Union. Eventually, it became about more than that, but for a lot of people, they never really signed on to freeing the slaves, and that was more than they were willing to do. And so, when it meant sending troops into the South, and in some people's minds, kind of a continuation of the war, people just didn't want to deal with it. And by the time you get to Rutherford B. Hayes being elected in 1876, everybody talks about the corrupt bargain that he makes to get elected. They call him Rutherford. Reconstruction was done no matter who was president at that point. Even Grant in his second term had a hard time continuing Reconstruction policies.
During and after the war, national emotions and ideals were high. Many in the North were passionate about preserving the Union and punishing the rebels. And while not as universal, many in the North were committed to freeing the slaves, if for no other reason, to give all of the death in the war some meaning.
And to prevent another one from happening, right? Everybody understood that the source of the conflict was slavery. And it was the source of 80 years of conflict between North and South that had only escalated. It had to be dealt with. It had to be taken off the table as a source of continued conflict.
By the end of the Civil War, the Confederacy had been defeated, securing the future of the Union. And by 1873, the first year of Grant's second term, the nation was suffering a depression. This, on top of the growing war weariness, meant Northern sentiment was no longer so strongly invested in the past moral causes, as people had their own financial hardships to deal with. Grant's Reconstruction policies demanded that time and resources be used to defend the newly freed slaves. With the country struggling through economic difficulties, these policies became less and less popular. As such, Grant began to dampen Reconstruction efforts. At the end of his second term, he oversaw the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended Reconstruction in the South. While Reconstruction wasn't a complete failure, it hardly met its idealistic aims.
And as I always say, if Tilden had become president, he would have ended Reconstruction. Reconstruction was ending regardless of who was president at that point.
As the nation at large lost interest in greater causes, so did many of those in public offices. Corruption began to run rampant during Grant's administration, as more and more people entering politics came from political machines and were motivated by money or job security more than loyalty to their people, nation, or states.
And if there's one thing that we could say is definitely a fault that Grant had, it was that he could be really naive in the way he trusted people. And he got taken advantage of because of that. We see it time and time again, especially in his own finances, where he ends up penniless, and that's the reason he has to hurry up and write his memoirs before he dies of cancer, because the guy that he trusted with his money basically screwed him out of all of it. So Grant trusted people close to him, and they took advantage of that, and that's why you see a lot of corruption in his administration.
Corruption especially ran deep in the Republican Party. It's widely believed that Grant wasn't involved in the corruption himself.
Yeah, I've never seen any credible claim by anyone that Grant was involved in any way, shape, or form with any of the corruption.
He tried to fight it, but simply wasn't experienced enough in politics to be effective. Grant had, after all, come from the military, and in a deliberate attempt at not being partisan, he hired many of his friends and allies from the military rather than Republicans already in Washington. This ultimately meant that Grant didn't have the skills or people around him to play the political game.
That's fair.
When he inevitably sought help from people in the political world, it came from the likes of Roscoe Conkling, someone who helped Grant fight corruption, but was just as corrupt himself.
I was going to say, Conkling is a product of the New York political machine. He is like when you talk about the spoils system and corruption in politics, Conkling's one of the first people that has to come to mind. Also, incidentally, had an affair with the former Kate Chase, who was Kate Sprague, Kate Chase was the daughter of Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, who was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary and later the Chief Justice of the United States. And I am not a fan of Salmon Chase, by far one of my least favored people in the North in politics during the Civil War. Even though he's from Ohio, just can't stand the guy. Conkling has an affair with Kate Sprague. It's a big, big deal, and she ends up getting a divorce from her husband, William Sprague, who was a millionaire from Rhode Island, had been a senator and I think a governor of Rhode Island, and was involved in a lot of corruption himself.
As even modern defenders of Grant will concede, he was a terrible judge of character.
Yeah.
Despite his successes in the Civil War...
And as I said, his judgment of character... I think comes down to a weakness in terms of thinking the best of people when he shouldn't have.
Simply didn't have a mind for politics, and as such, spent much of his time trying to figure out who he could trust without actually getting much done. A perfect example of this comes from his plan to annex Santo Domingo. Grant wanted to use the nation as a navy base, but also as a refuge for freed slaves. He hoped that by giving them new land to immigrate to, he'd also give them leveraging power in dealing with their southern white employers.
So, this is a pretty common theme among people who were abolitionists, even during the American Civil War, even guys like Lincoln. It was this recognition that in their minds they didn't see a scenario in which black people, free or not, would ever be equal. Would ever be truly equal with white people in the United States. And so they felt it was best for everybody involved if they found some land in Western Africa, like Liberia, or in Central America, or in the Caribbean, where they could resettle folks, they could give them their own country, let them be in charge and be separate. But Frederick Douglass and many of the black leaders were saying, no, this is our home every bit as much as it is your home, and we want to stay, even if that means it's going to be challenging for us. And so Grant has this deal in place to buy Santo Domingo for all of these reasons he just mentioned, but he can't get the Senate to ratify it.
Grant firmly believed he had the support of Senator Charles Sumner, but Sumner turned on Grant and withdrew his support, as he never liked Grant or took him seriously as a politician. Other failures include his plan for better treatment of Native Americans, which hardly even met its goals.
And this is fair, too. I think it's a fair criticism that Grant eventually allows the crackdown on the Sioux and others in the Great Sioux War, which happens during his administration. And it's fair to criticize him for going back on the treaty. But I think it's also important to note that I think among presidents in that era of westward expansion, I think Grant tried harder than most to be fair to the Native Americans. Now, that's not a high bar, but I think it's important to note that.
And his failure to properly respond to the Panic of 1873, which led to a recession, which at the time was called the Great Depression.
It was.
Even the successes of Grant's administration are generally overlooked, as is the case for the successes of many presidents of the time, such as Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester Arthur. For instance, each of them took steps towards civil service reform to end the old spoils system ushered in by Andrew Jackson, which made political appointments based on party loyalty rather than merit. In fact, Grant addressed civil service reform more seriously than any president up to that point. However, it's simply not an issue that captures the imagination of people today.
Right.
Grant's presidency is sometimes...
It's not an issue that captures the imagination of people today because it's not really something that gets talked about anymore. It's not a major political issue. A lot of these other issues were things that were being dealt with into the 20th century. Civil service reform was pretty much dealt with, or at least no longer an issue that was discussed by the time you get to the 20th century. So yeah, it's a relic of the past for many people.
Sometimes considered the first of the Gilded Age, an era in which robber barons, social reformers, and inventors all had a strong influence on the course of America and captured the nation's interest more than the president's. The overly negative attitudes towards Grant's presidency are sometimes attributed to the lost cause narrative.
So I want to go back to something he said a minute ago, which I think is really interesting and something I hadn't really considered, which is that part of the reason we don't talk so much about, we don't know a lot of the details of the presidents in that post-Civil War era up until the dawn of the 20th century, when we get to somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, is that our imagination of that time period focuses on other historical figures. John D. Rockefeller, Thomas Edison, people like that. So that's actually a really interesting point, and I think it's a fair one to make, too.
Which painted many of the Union's heroes in a negative light. It's perhaps due to the lost cause that for a long time, Grant wasn't just considered a forgettable or mediocre president, but one of the worst.
And that they downplayed significantly his role as a general as well, and made it sound like he was just a butcher who bludgeoned the South to death with greater numbers, and that's just not accurate.
His legacy has had more positive reviews since the 1960s, especially for his efforts to defend the freedmen. However, he's still far from being considered one of the greats among presidents.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly fair to put him in kind of the middle range. I don't think he deserves to be at the bottom, and I think he has risen over time. I'd put him in that 20 to 25 range somewhere, and I think that's a fair place for him.
He's written off as a corrupt president who infringed on states' rights and used the government for his own profit. At best, he's considered a champion of civil rights who boldly fought corruption all around him. And more moderate views present him as a president with honorable goals who saw some successes but was largely hampered by vast corruption which he was just not equipped to deal with.
I think that's fair.
Even if Grant's presidency was definitively great, it's possible he would still be more remembered for his Civil War service.
It's always going to be the case with someone like Grant. I mean, Grant is now one of the 3 highest-ranking generals in the history of the United States. There are 3 men who officially have the rank of General of the Armies of the United States, which is above a 5-star rank. 5-star is General of the Army. This is General of the Armies. And so you have George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and John J. Pershing. Just those 3.
Worth noting that even George Washington, who is often considered the greatest president in American history, is more renowned for his leadership in the Revolutionary War than anything he actually did as president. In some ways, the lack of a presidential legacy might speak to Grant's successes as a general.
And Grant's a way better general than George Washington.
Perhaps telling of Grant's own point of view is that his memoirs aren't focused on his life as a whole or his presidency, but rather his military service and end in 1865.
That's what people wanted to hear about, and he was writing to the audience. And it showed in how many copies it sold.
If you enjoyed this...
All right, that was good. I enjoyed that. I think he did a really good job, and I think he made some fantastic points. Let me know what else you think should have been said. What do you agree with, disagree with? Let's have a conversation. Why isn't Grant better remembered for his presidency? Thanks for watching.